Dr. Campbell, welcome to our program.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, your research investigates why people participate in civic life and politics. Could you describe your research and explain what it means for a country today to be considered a democratic country?
Well, let me start with my own research and what that might say about this country or any country and whether it's democratic. As you said, I'm interested in the question of why people do or don't get involved in civic life, which includes political activity. And I've studied a variety of things in people's lives that might bring them in or pull them out of civic life, including their religious involvement, or in some cases, the lack thereof, whether they're a secular person or a religious person. I've also looked at schools and how young people learn about their participation in civic life. And I would say that throughout all of my research, I have always been animated by the question of what does it mean to live in a democratic society? What does it mean to be a democratic citizen? And I've been studying that question. I've been interested in it for my entire career, so long before this current era that many people have described as a democratic crisis. But I would say there's a connection between a low level of civic participation and a threat to a democratic society. We've known for a long time, many scholars, myself included, but hardly limited to myself, have long shown that a robust civil society is the framework, is the foundation for a healthy democracy. And so as our civic life has deteriorated, and it certainly has, it is perhaps not surprising that we've seen challenges to our democratic society.
Now, you have written many books, including The American Grace with Dr. Robert Putnam. So, Dr. Campbell, according to your research in this particular book, why does religion divide American politics, in your opinion? Why do most Americans react negatively to mixing politics and religion?
Well, let me start actually with the second part of our subtitle. So it's how religion divides and unites us. Because there was once a time when religion was actually much more of a unifying force than it is today in American life. Why is it divisive today? Like what changed? Well, what changed is that it used to be that whether or not you were a Republican or a Democrat or a conservative or a liberal had really nothing to do with your religion. These two things were separate. Someone's religion was over here, someone's politics was over here. They were not necessarily related to one another. And a lot of people who are only familiar with our current political environment are surprised, shocked, maybe even skeptical to hear that, but it's absolutely true. If you go back to, say, the 1950s and 60s, how religious you were, which religion you were, had nothing to do with the way you voted. Well, we now live in a world where that's not the case, where whether or not you are religious, that question alone is strongly related to whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. And then among people who are religious, what kind of religion you subscribe to is now very strongly predictive of whether you are a conservative or a liberal and what kind of conservative you might be. And all of that has come about, I would say, because religion became identified by our political leaders as a potentially divisive force. It never used to be. When religion was invoked by politicians, it was to unify people. Now it is much more often the case that when religion is invoked, it's used to divide people, to be a wedge, to drive people apart from each other. So in American Grace, which is a book published in 2010, so it's a little dated now, we touch on both this idea that sometimes religion can be a unifier and sometimes it can be a divider. I would say that the trends we identified in that book, again, published a decade and a half ago, that pointed to the ways that religion divide us, those have only been amplified in the years since. And some of my more recent work has actually focused on how those divisions have come about.
Now, in American Grace, you note that most people believe they have salvation and that they are kind of a heaven bound, while clergy and most priests and pastors say that salvation is only or primarily to true followers of Christ. So here's my question. Now, the Bible seems to support the view of the priests and pastors. So what are your thoughts on this, and what is your research finding on this?
Well, this is one of the bottom line findings, one of the headlines that came out of American Grace. This idea that many Americans don't actually subscribe to their own theology, which, as you note, is often, depends a little bit on the religious tradition, but in most religions, you have to believe and do certain things in order to go to heaven. And for Christians, that is, you have to subscribe to Christianity. Obviously, there's a debate among different Christian groups over, is it all faith? Is it all works? Is it a combination of both? But regardless, there is an idea that there is a single path to heaven. But that is not the way most Americans see religion. Most Americans believe that good people, regardless of their faith, even if the person being asked the question is themselves a Christian, even those folks will often say you don't even have to be Christian to go to heaven. Even evangelical Christians will say that. And why is it? Well, the evidence we suggest in American Grace is it's because Americans actually have within their own personal social networks a very high degree of religious diversity. Most Americans have within their own families, certainly within their own neighborhoods, within their own workplaces, people who are of a different faith. And so when they are confronted, when they're exposed to people of different faiths, they come to appreciate what is good in other people, regardless of what religion they subscribe to.
Fantastic. That's a great finding. Now, let's talk about some important concepts in your research, Dr. Campbell. What is a social capital, and why is it essential for democracy?
Well, social capital is a term that's been around for a long time. I certainly didn't invent it. It is perhaps best known for or from the work of my collaborator and actual advisor when I was in graduate school, Robert Putnam. Although even Bob Putnam did not invent the term social capital. It had been around. It's just that I think Putnam is most associated with it today. And the term refers to the networks that people form with one another through their personal relationships. That when we come to know other people, we come to develop an appreciation for them, we come to trust them, we come to have a sense of reciprocity, not just with the individuals in our own social network, but the more we interact with others, the more we develop a high level of trust in our neighbors, in others who live in our communities, the more we have a sense of reciprocity. I do things for other people because I know that if I'm in need, they will do things for me. And the reason that idea that we come to trust one another is so important for a democracy is that's what enables our elected officials to work on behalf of the common good, because they come out of a culture in which people are thinking not of themselves, not just of their own narrow group, but instead of what is good for all. And so the more we associate with one another, the more we build these bridges with one another, the more we create a culture that leads to a better sense of the we rather than just simply the individual. Perfect.
And you also have researched about people without religious affiliation. Who are they, and how influential are they in American democracy?
One of the most stunning changes in the American social landscape over the last generation or so has been the dramatic rise in the percentage of Americans who have no religion. They are often in the literature called the nones, the N-O-N-E kind of none, because when they're asked, what's your religion, they'll say none. It's not my favorite term, actually, but we'll go with it. The nones. Dramatic increase. If we'd been having this conversation, say 30 years ago, we probably wouldn't even talk about people without a religious affiliation because they were such a small share of the U.S. population. They might have been 3 or 5%. Now, depending on the survey, there's somewhere between 25 and 30% of the U.S. population. Now, that's the group that gets the most attention. People who have no religious affiliation, because they're easy to track, and so you can see charts that show this dramatic increase. But what my research, and I should mention my co-authors, Jeff Lehman and John Green, what the three of us have shown is that that population of people who don't have a religion is actually divided into two distinct groups that are important to understand. The first are people who are simply not religious. They define themselves by what they are not. But there's another group that we call the secularists. These are people who define themselves by what they are. And what are they? They are people who have embraced a secular worldview. Rather than relying on religion to guide their lives, they rely on science or philosophy or some mixture of the two. But whatever they're basing their lives on, it's not a religious source. It's from something else. But they have a very clear worldview. They're not people who just simply, I'm not religious, I don't go to church, I don't believe in God. That's not what it is. They actually have a well-articulated philosophy. And those people, the secularists, are very politically engaged. They're somewhat civically engaged. And they're a force in American politics. Those other folks, the non-religious, they're not civically engaged. They're sitting on the civic sidelines and are largely dropouts from civic life. And that's why it's so important to distinguish between those two groups, because they're very different from one another.
Perfect. Now, moving towards the end of our interview, let's talk about a little bit about the Trump administration from an academic and perhaps more pragmatic perspective. So President Trump in his second term governs with full control of both chambers of Congress, while his relationship with the Supreme Court is kind of a complex. Checks and balances are not working properly. Now, aside from impeachment, the 25th Amendment, or resignation, which, in your opinion, is the most feasible way to remove or limit President Trump's scope of executive authority, if you will, to protect American democracy?
Well, that is not an easy question to answer, because we are witnessing what we might describe as euphemistically the challenges of the American constitutional system. That is, the framers, I don't think, ever envisioned an executive who would exert this much authority, that would attempt anyway to exert this much authority over so many areas that are clearly the domain of Congress, the directly elected branch of government. So what can we, or those who oppose the Trump administration, do about it? Well, it comes back to civil society. So look at where the administration has experienced pushback. Well, Minneapolis is a good example. And why was there so much opposition to the ICE surge in Minneapolis? It is not a coincidence that Minneapolis and Minnesota, the state, is well known for being what is sometimes called the social capital. It is a place where people have historically come together in collective action. And so it is not a surprise that that is where you saw the kind of collective action the entire world watched against the ICE surge there. I don't want to trivialize this and say, we just have to, rely on places with high social capital and that'll fix everything. It's not that simple, but it is a demonstration of why civil society matters. And that matters when it comes to elections, and it matters to what elected officials are hearing from their constituents. Because we may think of the Republican Party as being completely enthralled to Donald Trump. That is not the case. We're actually seeing that just in the last few weeks. There have been many Republicans in Congress who have not necessarily towed the administration's line. And why are they doing that? Because they're thinking about the midterms. They have to think about whether or not they're going to get elected again. And whether or not that happens is largely a function of what is happening with the civil society within their own districts and within their own states. So
Perfect.
While it can be very frustrating for people who are opposed to the administration right now, I do think there are glimmers of hope, if you will, if you are opposed to the administration, that yes, it is actually possible to stop an executive from overreaching, even in a situation of uniform control like the Republicans have right now.
President Trump, President Nixon, different, alike, or what's your thoughts on these two?
It's interesting you asked that question. I had an undergraduate student of mine just this past year write a thesis comparing how the public reacted to Nixon's crimes during Watergate and how the public has reacted to actions that Donald Trump has taken. And it is absolutely fascinating that when you tell voters today, so she did a big survey and, presented this to just regular people. When you describe what Nixon did with Nixon's name associated with it, virtually everyone says, yeah, that was a problem, including Republicans. When you describe the exact same thing, so she found examples of what Nixon did versus what Trump has done, and she was able to describe them using the same language. When you describe those same things done by Donald Trump and you identify them as having been done by Trump, perhaps not surprisingly, Democrats will condemn it and Republicans will excuse it. That's what's different about our politics today than 50 years ago, that Richard Nixon faced pushback not just from Democrats, but from his fellow Republicans as well. And we don't see that today.
Perfect. Now let's talk about President Trump's second term and his mighty hand on technocracy. It is becoming a administration that serves pretty much the technocratic group. So, Dr. Campbell, how can we defend American democracy from technocrats like Mr. Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, and from shady cryptocurrency interests, such as the crypto, all those bitcoins and, all that? Anyhow, see, with Trump allegedly profiting from his position and VP J.D. Vance lacking a clear agenda but seeking the presidency in 2028, so tell us briefly, how can we defend democracy against third world-like technocrats such as Thiel and Musk, and third world-like politicians such as J.D. Vance and President Trump?
Well, here's how I would answer that question. If you look at many of our both social, political, and I'll even add economic conditions today, they're very similar to what we saw during the era known as the Gilded Age, so the late 1800s, early 1900s. And at that time, there was high inequality like there is today. And while, of course, it wasn't AI that people were concerned about in those days, there was a great concern about mixing business with politics, right? This was the time of the robber baron. This is when trusts, monopolies were very much a concern among the American public. And what happened? Well, the American public didn't just roll over and say, well, that's the way it's going to be. Instead, we got the progressive era where a lot of things changed, and a lot of the reforms that we now point to and have sort of become our, basic way of doing things in American politics came from that era because people were upset with the way government was working and the sort of corruption that they saw, and they didn't like the way the economy was operating because they felt there was too much going to the top and not enough to the middle. And so it was really a stunning change that I don't think actually gets enough attention when we think about what could happen today. That doesn't mean I have an obvious blueprint, here's what we need to do X, Y, Z in order to bring about change. But it does suggest that it is possible, again, with a strong civil society, to see reform take place. Not in exactly the same way that the progressives did it, and I'm not even suggesting that what the progressives did was always great. A lot of what they did was not great. But at least people took it seriously and knew that there needed to be change. That is the difference. If people just sit on the sidelines and give up, then it's not going to get any better.
Okay. Now, moving really towards the end of our interview, do you think that the second presidency of President Trump is damaging our democracy permanently, or it's something that it can be ameliorated in the future?
It's a good question. I try to be an optimistic person. I teach a big class here at Notre Dame called Keeping the Republic, which is all about the current era and what does it mean to live in a democratic society and what's happening to American democracy. And my appeal to students is not to give up hope, that it is possible actually to see a better America. And I point to these historical examples that I've mentioned of, yes, it is possible for the country to pull itself out of a highly divisive, polarized time and hopefully make things a little better. My concern is not so much about specific policies that come out of this administration, because those can be overturned, and we're already seeing that. Courts push back, Congress pushes back. What I'm more concerned about are our young people. I really worry that we've now had a half generation of young people who have come of age in a political era where they've only seen the current period, if you'll say, if I can put it that way. They've only witnessed the sort of deterioration of the democratic norms and sort of the elimination of the idea of the common good. And so to them, that's what American democracy is. And given that that's all they've seen, it's not surprising that many young people are not very optimistic about democracy. They don't think democracy is worth it because they don't see it working for them. That's what I worry about. And that's why it's so important that those of us who have a longer memory, that know there was once a time when it was different, can have confidence that perhaps it can be better in the future. And we need to keep repeating that message to our young people so they don't just assume that the way it is now is the way it always will be.
Perfect, perfect. And then last question. Thank you so much so far. What message would you give Congress? How can congressmen support democracy and legislate kind of a properly and functional under a populist and technocratic Trump administration?
Well, my message to Congress would be to read the Constitution, because the Constitution makes it very clear that Congress is not only the body that has the power of the purse, but has a lot of authority that, for now at least, Congress, or at least the Republicans in Congress, have conceded to the White House. And that is not the way the founders intended the system. And if nothing else, I would hope that members of Congress, whether they're Republicans or Democrats or of any other party, that they would take seriously their charge to represent their own community, that their commitment should be to their community and to the Constitution and to the country, not to their party. Now, that's a big ask. We have a very partisan political system, obviously, but we are seeing some hints, as I mentioned earlier, that there are Republicans in Congress who are thinking about the midterms. They're thinking about their own role in the constitutional system, and they have said, we're going to push back, that we're not going to accept everything the administration does because that is their role. That's what Congress is supposed to do.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you.
All right. Well, I hope that was all right for you.
Yes, it's